Just as we've a quorum, we'll commence the meeting. We're in public session. I have an apology from Senator Mary Ann O'Brien. And just to remind members to switch off the phones, I propose just to go into private session for a short while to discuss the format of this morning's meeting and any other business. Is that agreed? Agreed. We're resuming public session, and just before we begin, can I once again remind members and witnesses and people in the gallery to turn off their mobile phones. I would like to welcome Mr. Brendan Gleeson, Assistant Secretary, Mr. Dermot Ryan, Deputy Chief Inspector, Mr. Jerry Greeley, Senior Inspector, Ms. Emer McGough and Ms. Jane Dempsey, Assistant Principals from the Department of Agriculture, Food and Marine, and to thank you for coming before the committee today. Just following our engagement, since you briefed us at the outset of this exercise, there are some issues and concerns and that the committee would like either to clarify or express to yourselves. So just before we begin, on the matter of privilege, I want to bring to your attention that witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect to the evidence you are to give to the committee here. However, if you are directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to do so, you are entitled thereafter only to a qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given. You are asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that where possible you should not criticise nor make charge against any persons or entity by name or in such a way as to make him, her or it identifiable. And members are reminded of long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that members should not comment on, criticise or make charges against either a person outside the Houses or an official either by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. I understand Mr. Gleeson wants to make an opening statement, so or any of the other officials. So, Mr. Gleeson, to you.
Well, Chairman, thank you. It's good to be here again. We were here on the 1st of July. I made an opening statement on that occasion, so I won't take up too much time with this one. We'll just very briefly go through the main provisions of the bill, its purpose, and or the draft head rather, and then if anybody has any issues, we'll try and clear them up here. If anybody is seeking any further information, or the committee for the purposes of its report that we don't have here, of course, we'll provide it at a later stage. So, very briefly, the draft general scheme of the Horse Racing Ireland Amendment Bill 2014 has been approved by Government. In accordance with procedure, the draft general scheme has been published on the Department's website and forwarded to the Committee for Pre-Legislative Scrutiny. The Department appeared here on the 1st of July, and you've had a number of other stakeholders in since then. Of course, the Irish horse racing industry makes a significant contribution to employment and to the Irish economy. It's estimated to underpin 14,000 jobs, 1.1 billion in economic output, and exports to the value of 205 million to 37 countries in 2013. Horse Racing Ireland is a commercial state body established under the Horse and Greyhound Racing Act 2001. HRI is charged with the overall administration, promotion and development of the industry. The 2001 Act sets out the mechanism under which state support is provided to HRI. HRI provides funding for integrity services to the racing regulatory body. The Turf Club, including the Irish National Hunt Steeplechase Committee, a private body, is designated for the purposes of this legislation as the racing regulatory body and is charged with carrying out these functions under the current legislation. So HRI has provided between 5.5 million and 7 million per annum to the Turf Club in respect of integrity functions over the last 5 years. In 2012, the Minister for Agriculture, Food and the Marine commissioned Indicon International Consultants to carry out an independent review of certain aspects of the horse racing industry. The Department facilitated a wide stakeholder consultation process as part of that review. Written submissions were sought from interested parties and forwarded to Indicon for their consideration. The resultant report examined the legislation, governance, structures, funding, management of the industry, including the streamlining of functions assigned by legislation to HRI and the RRB, and made a number of recommendations in this regard. The report contained recommendations aimed at providing a more viable and sustainable horse racing sector, and Minister Coveney announced his broad acceptance of the recommendations and his intention to introduce amending legislation to facilitate the introduction of the changes recommended by Indicon. Arising from the Indicon report, HRI and the racing regulatory body established a streamlining task force with a view to achieving efficiencies and to achieve a minimum of 10% reduction in costs as identified in the report. Consultants Smith and Williamson were appointed by the task force to act as facilitator in these discussions, and Smith and Williamson prepared a report containing 18 recommendations, which they estimated would give rise to 1.8 million per annum in savings. So, in preparing the draft general scheme of the Horse Racing Ireland Amendment Bill 2014, the Department engaged in discussions with HRI and the Racing Regulatory Body in relation to the recommendations in Indicon and Smith and Williamson over a considerable period of time. The draft scheme was circulated to a number of departments and to the AG's office for observations. A number of observations were received, and these were accommodated insofar as this was possible in the draft general scheme. And that has been forwarded to the committee for pre-legislative scrutiny, and we've been through much of that already, Chairman. The Minister for Agriculture, Food and the Marine obtained a Cabinet approval on the 3rd of June for the draft general scheme and permission to proceed to pre-legislative scrutiny. So, the main provisions, and I'll just briefly touch on these. The draft general scheme of the Horse Racing Ireland Amendment Bill 2014 builds on recommendations of the Indicon report and is intended to strengthen governance and transparency within the administration of horse racing, clarify the respective roles of HRI and the Racing Regulatory Body, improve accountability and control over state funding, and streamline the administrative functions of the two bodies. In regard to governance, it is proposed to reduce and alter the structure of the HRI board in order to improve efficiency and accountability and increase ministerial representation on the board in accordance with Indicon representations. And in the context of that recommendation, Indicon would have looked at international best practice and they would have taken that on board. The functions of the Racing Regulatory Body will be maintained and strengthened, and in particular the draft general scheme includes an enabling provision permitting the Minister to authorise Racing Regulatory Body personnel to carry out functions under the Animal Remedies Act. The general scheme provides for a single streamlined administrative structure within HRI for registration, financial and other functions of HRI and the Racing Regulatory Body, without compromising the integrity functions of the Racing Regulatory Body or their property rights in relation to income derived from the registration of hunter certificates for point-to-point racing and the licensing of participants in racing. In this context, I should make it clear that there would be no change insofar as the organisation of point-to-points is concerned. The organisation of meetings, the issue of hunter certificates, the acceptance of horse racing entries and declarations will continue to be managed by hunt clubs. However, the registration functions, that is, the registration of hunter certificates and trainers, will reside, along with other registration functions, in HRI. The scheme provides for enhanced control and accountability with explicit provisions empowering the Minister to issue directives to HRI, requiring HRI to comply with codes of practice, and permitting the Minister to withhold funding instalments from HRI and Bord na Gun if he is dissatisfied with their strategic and other plans. It provides for the accounts of the Racing Regulatory Body to be audited by the CNAG and published, and for the CEO of the RRB to attend an Oireachtas committee as required. So, key provisions include those relating to improved governance, changes to the HRI's board size and structure to improve efficiency and accountability. The HRI board currently comprises 14 members, that's the chairman and 13 ordinary members. The Minister nominates only the chairman and one other member of the board, the latter to represent the interests of the horse racing in Northern Ireland. All other members of the board are nominated by representative organisations. Indicon suggested that this has resulted in low levels of government or ministerial control over the processes and decision-making of the HRI board. It is proposed that the number of ordinary board members is reduced from 13 to 12, with an increase in the number of ministerial appointees from 1 to 3. The representation from the RRB on the board of HRI is reduced from 5 to 3. HRI currently has 26 board committees which are important in supporting the main work of the board. The Indicon report suggested that none of the existing committees focused adequately on the particular needs of the betting sector or on employee requirements. And against this background, the general scheme provides for the creation of 2 new statutory committees to represent those employed in the sector and the betting industry respectively, in addition to the 2 existing committees which deal with issues of media rights and race fixtures. The scheme also provides for a standard 5-person membership for all 4 statutory committees proposed under this legislation. And those committees are the Race Fixtures Committee, the Industry Services Committee, the Betting Committee and the Media Rights Committee. And for HRI to appoint the chair of the Race Fixtures Committee. Under the current legislation, the latter committee is chaired by an RRB director of HRI. Maintaining and strengthening of the RRB integrity functions. The retention by the RRB of responsibility for integrity functions and for the licensing of race courses, jockeys, valets and other participants in racing is maintained. At local level, the issue of hunter certificates, the management of horse racing entries and declarations for point-to-point races will remain with the local hunt clubs. No change there. No change. Amendments to the rules of racing will be subject to consultation with HRI in the context of budgetary arrangements. I have to stress that HRI will not have any imprimatur over the rules of racing, but it is considered appropriate for the sake of good order to have some level of consultation where the rules which could have an impact on budgetary requirements are to be changed. The bill also includes an enabling provision permitting the Minister for Agriculture, Food and the Marine to appoint persons or classes of persons to carry out all or any of the functions of authorised officers under the Animal Remedies Act 1993, subject to such conditions as the Minister feels appropriate. And this provision was included at the request of the Racing Regulatory Body. On streamlining and efficiency, the general heads provide for greater clarity in relation to the functions of HRI, including the power to issue directives setting rules and procedures in relation to its functions. There is a lack of clarity in the current legislation regarding responsibility for the administration and financial management of the Irish horse racing industry. This scheme provides for a single streamlined administrative structure within HRI for registration, licensing, financial and other functions of HRI and the RRB, without compromising the integrity functions of the RRB. This will require data sharing between HRI and RRB. This streamlining measure includes the processing but not ownership of income from the licensing functions and registration fees for hunter certificates and trainers from point to points, currently administered by the RRB. This will eliminate any need for duplication between HRI and the RRB, particularly in regard to certain administration aspects. In particular, the registration of hunter certificates and the registration of point-to-point trainers or handlers. And I stress that relates only to the registration functions. It will also pave the way for increased efficiency in the administration of areas such as finance, IT role, payroll and pensions. In relation to point-to-points, however, fees for issuing hunter certificates, fixtures and entries will remain firmly with the local hunt clubs, as will responsibility for arranging such meetings. I just want to say something brief about control and accountability. The scheme provides for improved ministerial control with explicit provisions empowering the Minister to issue directions to HRI and requiring HRI to furnish information in relation to the scope of its activities, including compliance with codes of practice or other government policy documents, to the Minister for Agriculture, Food and the Marine when requested. There is no explicit obligation in current legislation requiring HRI to comply with the requirements of the Code of Practice for the governance of state bodies or for the RRB to report to HRI, and this deficiency is being addressed. There are insufficient provisions in the current legislation with regard to the procedure for making payments to HRI and to Bord na Gun to allow the Minister for Agriculture, Food and the Marine to withhold financial support if he is dissatisfied with the strategic and other plans submitted to support any funding proposals or their implementation. It is proposed to provide an explicit permission for the Minister to withhold funding instalments if he is dissatisfied with the strategic or other plans submitted to support any funding proposals or their implementation. Funding may also be withheld where HRI or Bord na Gun have failed to provide information requested by the Minister or to comply with the direction of the Minister. Similarly, the RRB shall be required to furnish information to HRI in relation to its activities when requested to do so, and this information may be taken into account by HRI in determining the annual budgetary requirements of the RRB. The accounts of the RRB will be audited by the Controller and Auditor General and published. The Chief Executive of the RRB will be obliged to attend the Oireachtas committees as required. There is also a provision permitting the Minister to require the HRI and the RRB to agree procedures to ensure compliance with government codes of practice, guidelines or policy documents, and in relation to the provision of financial and other information in relation to any matter funded by HRI. The scheme also empowers HRI to make various deductions from prize money in accordance with HRI directives. This is essentially a reflection of current practice. However, HRI cannot make changes in the directives governing deductions for charitable funds administered by RRB without prior agreement of the Racing Regulatory Body. And this provision is intended to protect the status quo because the RRB funds a number of very worthy charities from these deductions, and we certainly wouldn't want any change in that without full consultation. So, Chairman, that concludes my opening statement. I know we've been through some of these provisions previously, and if there are any questions arising, I'm happy to deal with them.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Gleeson. Deputy Fair.
I want to thank Mr. Gleeson for his presentation this morning, and the whole process has been quite open and very, very helpful, and obviously it will help all of us to come to the proper decision as a relation.
Deputy Pringle, have you anything?
Not at the moment, sure.
Okay. Deputy Hayden.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks the officials for coming in before us this morning. I think it is worthwhile because the first time you were in, you were probably providing answers for questions that we didn't have at the time, and having met all the stakeholders, we're much better briefed now. That's where we're at. I have a number of different points I'd just like to raise with you on the basis of some of the presentations that were made to us, so if you bear with me, I hope they're kind of relatively in order. Just starting with Head 2, the Turf Club in their submission mentioned that point-to-points in general weren't mentioned in the con or in existing legislation, and they questioned the need for them now to be for that to happen. And just to clarify, you said there in your presentation the method of registration. At present, you apply to the Hunt Club for a Hunter Cert, and then you register the Hunter Cert with the Turf Club, and they're two different fees. Is that correct? And then around the acceptance of entries and fees in point-to-points is all still handled locally by the Hunt Club. That's not changing in any way. And you might just outline then about prize money in relation to point-to-points. Is that funded out of that, or is how much money is in the prize money for the point-to-points? Around the money issue in general for the Turf Club, and how that the suggestion of what they have will be taken into account. Can you clarify, is that looking at the different funding streams they would have from, obviously they might have commercial interest, they might have interest outside of integrity services, or is it purely for the money from the integrity services? Does it take into account historic money that they might have in savings of either the Turf Club or the Hunt Committee, or is it purely that you only look at and take into account money raised from integrity services? That would be important. The issue was raised by the race courses about the need for, or that would be useful to have a proxy representative on the board. Would you see difficulties with how that would work? Is that something that the department will be open-minded to, that on days where, in particular for the representative race courses, if that person from their racecourse was having a meeting at the end, was an important meeting on, they mightn't be there, and therefore then the Racecourse Association wouldn't be represented. So just what your views on that would be. Can I seek a bit of clarification around the Industry Services Committee? In general, one of the main things we had from every group to come in is board representation, and we have a challenge before us now as to how we look at that. If everybody is to have representation on the board could be quite large. But if you start picking some and not others, and everybody makes very valid arguments as to why they should have full representation. I know the Turf Club in their presentation, it referenced the UK Horseman's Group, which is an umbrella body. Do you see the Industry Services Committee being something similar or equivalent? And just on that, in Head 4, Part 7, 1F, it mentions stable employees. And in Head 6, 3C, stable employees are not explicitly named. It's talking about people directly employed in the industry. And you know, we had a compelling cases here from the jockeys who said that them being lumped in with people directly employed like stable staff, they wouldn't necessarily always have the same issues, and that's a valid point. But just on the point of the stable staff, I am conscious there's an awful lot of them. We have thousands of people employed as stable staff around the country, and to make sure that they are expressly represented or have their own head in will be important. So maybe that anomaly between the two heads is something that could be looked at, and you might just outline a little bit more about how you see the Industry Services Committee working. Just in relation to Head 5, the Turf Club would have been strong that on the view that where that goes beyond the Indicon report and goes beyond Smith and Williamson. They also made the point that the stall handlers and photo finish staff are under the HRI, and they were suggesting that then meant they couldn't bring in those staff if there were questions around the rules of racing, if there was any anomaly. Is that the case, or is there some way you see around that? I think the Turf Club would be interested, or would be keen from what they were saying to see if that could come back in under the Turf Club end of things. And what about then also under Head 5, the Turf Club made a proposal that the racing regulatory body be funded directly by the department on the basis of a multi-annual basis, or at the least retain minimum financial independence. That obviously would be the first part of that would be going against what is in the heads so far. And would you see any possibility of that, or what would be the argument against them being funded directly in a separate stream? And then also, again, linked with what I asked at the start about financial independence is key. Just with regard to the Media Rights Committee, just seek clarification on that. That now is a committee that can have, can that committee now have people come in from the outside who aren't board members? And is that something that was the case in the past? Or not. And then, look, there was a lot of concern raised about the whole issue of directives and how the HRI would issue directives and how they would work. And in their submission, the racing regulatory body had talked about terms of trade and questioned why they're called directives and not simply terms of trade or something similar, picking up on the HRI's presentation. They say the meaning and legal status of a directive is unclear, and that there can't be two rule-making bodies for the sport. Is there some clarity that can be provided throughout the legislation in the whole area of directives? Is there some way that it can be maybe a little bit more clarity provided to it? That's what I have for the minute, Chair. Thanks.
Okay. Senator, you've indicated
It's just one question. I think Mark's covered most of it there, but I suppose I thank Mr. Gleeson for the presentation. I suppose we've gone through this very comprehensively with all the stakeholders, and I suppose the biggest issue with the stakeholders is the makeup of the board, and we see where it's been reduced from 13 to 12 with the Minister going to appoint 3. I feel a lot of the stakeholders, and I think it is worth discussing or making a recommendation to the department in relation to this, because some of the stakeholders feel that they're being left out of the system by not getting in place on the board. So I'd welcome your comments in relation to it was indicated that it should be reduced from 13 to 12, but the Minister should have 3 appointments. I'd like your comments in relation to it. Could you envisage that we maybe would be able to propose that the board be increased by 2, maybe to 14 or 15, so maybe that we'll be able to cover all the stakeholders, because it is an important industry, as you've outlined, and it is important that everybody has a say in relation to the board of HRI. Thank you, Chair.
Okay. I think I'll come to Mr. Gleeson now, because there's a fair list of questions there. If you want to respond, then I'll come back around to the members again.
Okay, as you say, there's a lot there, so I'll try and get through it all. The first issue maybe relates to the point-to-points and how they will operate, and we're very sensitive to the local input into point-to-points and the volunteerism, and we're aware that that's a highly sensitive issue, and we think there are sufficient safeguards in the general scheme to protect that. So just to indicate how the point-to-points work at the moment, first of all, HRI do provide about €1.5 million per annum to point-to-points. And that goes towards the provision of prize money. There's a grant of about €2,500 per fixture, as I understand it, and €500,000 goes to the National Hunt Club for integrity services at point-to-points. So, to focus for a moment on the change in relation to point-to-points. So the only change in the HRI role in relation to point-to-points proposed in the general scheme is that the registration functions of hunter certificates and participants in point-to-point steeplechases will be carried out along with all other registration functions within HRI. Now, that's entirely separate from the issue of hunter certificates and the acceptance of horse racing entries. So those functions have always resided with the local hunt clubs, and the funding associated with those functions resides with the hunt clubs. That's the issue of the certificates and the acceptance of horse racing entries. There will be no change in that, no change. So from the perspective of the person on the ground organising point-to-points, there will be no visible or actual change. So what we're talking about here is a streamlining of a registration function, and the fees from the registration functions will be streamlined into an administrative system in HRI, with no change on the ground, no change in the issue of hunter certificates, in the acceptance of horse racing entries, or in the arrangement of those point-to-points. Okay, so I think that's a very important point to clarify. The second thing you spoke about, Deputy, was the funding. And so it has always been the case, and maybe this question of the direct funding from the department can be dealt with here as well. It has always been the case that we've had this cascade of funding from HRI, from the department to HRI to the Turf Club. And HRI, just to be clear about it, is a state body established for the purposes of administering horse racing. It's a state body established for that purpose. And it's entirely appropriate, in our view, that you would have this cascade of funding to other relevant bodies from HRI. And we wouldn't consider it to be appropriate to change that. Now, within that, of course, you have to be careful to protect the independence of the integrity function. And again, there are a number of checks and balances provided for in the general scheme to provide for that. Firstly, if you look at the composition of the board as proposed in the bill, we have 3 Turf Club members on the board. We have 3 ministerial nominees on the board, and we have a broad range of representatives of the racing sector. So I think there's a very important kind of balance struck there in the composition of that board in terms of ensuring that integrity functions are carried out correctly. The second thing is that what we're providing for is that in the context of seeking funding from HRI, and this is taxpayers' money, it's 5, 6 or 7 million euros worth of taxpayers' money, that HRI will be able to take into account funding streams to Turf Club deriving from its statutory functions in relation to integrity, and only in relation to those statutory functions. So I think you have to consider here what structure we have at the moment, and we have a very unusual governance structure here, which we're not starting with a blank page. So we have a state agency which administers racing, and we have what is essentially a private body. And the private body, for the purposes of this legislation, carries out certain statutory functions. And in the context of carrying out those statutory functions, it's called the Racing Regulatory Body. So in its private capacity, the Turf Club may well carry on all kinds of activities. They may run race courses, they may rent gallops, they may establish hotels, they may have interests in commercial enterprises. That's not what we're talking about here. All we're saying is that when determining how much taxpayers' money the Racing Regulatory Body needs to carry out integrity functions provided for by statute, that you have to take account, it would be bizarre not to take account, of funding deriving from the exercise of those functions. So just to be crystal clear about this, the Turf Club's private funding in its capacity as a private club is not affected here at all. We're only talking about taking into account the funding deriving from the statutory functions it carries out here. I think that's a really very important point. You mentioned the question of the proxy members of a state board. Well, it's possible to do that. Personally, I don't think that's appropriate. I think if you're appointed to a state board, it's a very serious position. You need continuity. You need an appreciation of what went on at previous meetings. For the sake of good order, I think an appointee to a board is an appointee to a board. So I certainly would be absolutely opposed to the idea that when you engage in something as serious as participating in a state board, that you could bring a proxy along. It's not like voting in a shareholders meeting in a company. This is a different kind of engagement, and you're engaging on a range of policy issues which require continuity from meeting to meeting. So that's my position on the question of the proxies. You mentioned the Industry Services Committee. So, and you know, Indicon recognises that when you have a representative board, there are strengths, many strengths deriving from the fact that it's representative. But equally, if you look at kind of international best practice, and not just among state agencies, but generally, I think there's a broad recognition that smaller boards tend to function more effectively. So, in relation to the specific provisions in these general scheme, I suppose what I say about that is it's not an arbitrary. What we've included here isn't arbitrary. It's based on an exercise conducted by Indicon where there was broad consultation and an examination of international best practice. And therefore, what's in our general scheme is reflective of the conclusions that Indicon came to. Now, it's always the case with a representative board that everybody wants to be represented. That's inevitable, and so you try to strike an appropriate balance between representation and between effective running of a board. Now, when we speak about the Industry Services Committee, which is a new vehicle representing jockeys and staff, stable staff, permanent staff and staff in the industry. So the representation mechanism there is that board will be able to appoint, its chairman will serve on the board. So there is representation for jockeys and permanent staff and stable staff. Sorry, jockeys and qualified riders, persons employed in the horse racing industry, and persons employed directly in the horse racing industry. So that group will have its own committee for the very first time. It will elect its own chairman, and the chairman will serve on the board. So there will be representation on the board for those people.
Point, because we get lost if we go away from it. Just the point I was making was that in Head 6, Part 3C, it's persons employed directly in the horse racing industry. In Head 4, it's explicitly referenced as stable staff. That just might be taken on board when the final drafting is happening, because I think that is an important distinction.
Absolutely, Deputy. If they're intended to be comprehended in the wording that's there, but I accept there's an inconsistency between the two sections. We'll be sure they're explicitly referenced in the. So obviously, if that's part of the report emanating from the committee, we'll take it on board. Now, you asked me quite a specific question then about stall holders. If you could just give me one moment just to... So, Deputy, sorry for the delay, but just on the question of stall holders. So if you go back to the 2001 Act, this provision really hasn't changed. The provision and maintenance of mobile track equipment, including starting stalls, photo finish, camera patrol equipment, and any other such equipment agreed from time to time between HRI and the racing regulatory body to provide the racing regulatory body with photographs, films, sound recordings and other connected materials or data generated. So these functions in relation to stall holders have always resided with HRI, and there's no proposal to change it.
Is the change, through the Chair, is the change not in the new proposal in the heads under Head 5CK that to provide and maintain mobile track equipment is what was there, and the change is now to provide, maintain and operate? And just in general terms, the point that Turf Club made that it's not ideal to have the photo finish staff, I think, are included as well as the stall handlers, that if there was an integrity issue, they're saying they can't bring them in and question them on that. Just Is that the case? Is that your view of it? Is that a potential anomaly?
Yeah, so, Deputy, I mean, what I'm advised is that word operate is a reflection of current practice. It's the way it's always been done, and it was provided for in the 2001 Act. That word is a new word, but it's a reflection of current practice, so it's not our intention to change that. The question of the financial independence of the racing regulatory body, well, I think I've dealt with that, and the question of this cascade of accountability and whether the racing regulatory body should get funding directly from the department. Well, it's not my view that it should. There's no change proposed in that regard in the current draft scheme. I think that should be made clear. This isn't a change, but in the context of any delegation of functions from a department in the context of the establishment of any state agency, there is this cascade of accountability, and I think the one we've provided for here, which is a strengthening of existing provisions, but not any fundamental change in that cascade, I think that's appropriate.
Okay. Deputy or Senator O'Neill had a query then about the
board. I think he dealt with it in. Senator or Deputy Hayden asked the same question. It's just they feel that a smaller committee works more efficiently.
No, that's
so,
okay. If you're happy enough. Deputy.
Just in relation to the smaller board, it seems to me that lots of consultants in this country get big money for proposing what becomes a fashion, and then the fashions change and magic numbers come in. Other than that, some people irrationally think 13 is an unlucky number. Does it make a huge significant difference if it's 13 or 14 rather than 12? But there's an argument in favour of both, because particularly in a board where there are people with interest, because these are all been nominated by interest except the three by the minister, you could easily get people standing outside the meeting. We had a farcical situation recently where there was a board, I think, of 19 and 20, but only 5 people wound up making the big decision because everyone else was put outside the door for one reason or another. So how wedded are the department to this magic 12? Or is it just kind of a figure and give or take, we're in around the number? The second question I have, as you said yourself, you're giving 3 out of 12, that's a quarter of the seats on the board, to a group called the Turf Club. And you also say they carry out statutory functions under the Act. Now, my understanding is that the Turf Club is a self-perpetuating private body that doesn't have open membership, and that it's not possible for anybody who wants to get in, who isn't chosen by those who are already in, to get into it. Would it not be appropriate at this stage, in the interest of openness, transparency, of citizens' rights, as all the things that we aspire to in a proper functioning republic, that the Turf Club would be obliged to have some open system of membership before it would be given statutory functions and before it would be given 3 seats on the board? And I'd be very interested in how the department can justify giving a private body, which is self-perpetuating in its membership, in other words, existing membership invite the new members, and which the great and good, in which the ordinary people are excluded from if they're not part of the great and good clique, and invited by the membership, and we're giving them both statutory functions and 3 seats on the board. And I was wondering how you justify that in the present thinking on good governance and openness and citizens' rights and all the rest.
Okay. Any other member? Deputy, are you okay?
Yeah, no, I just with the race courses as well. I mean,
yeah, well, before bringing in non-members, I'll invite you in to speak then.
Yeah. One of the points about the Association of Irish Race Courses, I mean, there a lot of work being done by those, and one of the proposals is to, with the HRI to be omnipotent. They're going to have total control of everything. I mean, a lot of you people don't understand that the HRI is a runaway train in terms of charges. I've made this point before. There's no end. I mean, I heard you saying there a few minutes ago about they're going to have a look at this about point to points. And I mean, at least with point to points, I mean, if we're charged, we know what we're getting. And there's an end result there. And we see ordinary people there, all the ordinary folk there on a Sunday, giving up their Sundays and Saturdays right across the various courses, point to point courses. And they're doing it on a voluntary basis and looking after things, and they take the money, and when we know it's all been in trying to invest in improving things. So I have concern about that, because I mean, if they're going to take over, if they're going to have the financial management of all aspects of Irish racing, there is a concern that HRI would be looking into the finances of race courses. Race courses, see, they have control of the race courses and ownership of race courses. They allocate everything. Programs and fixtures and everything else. You know, how much more power are we going to give to this body? That I think we should be circumscribing some of the powers they're getting. You know, you talk about being a state authority and all like that, but I've given lots of examples, and I was amazed by the reaction that I evoked from a lot of people out there. You know, ordinary people who are trying to bring forward horses, and even people trying to breed, and especially in the national hunt areas and that. Not everybody is a successful. They're not all going to Goffs, and they're not bidding 2 and 3 million for. There's a lot of people there bidding. They're glad to get something for 3 or 4,000. You know, and the next minute they're loaded out with charges all over the place. And what worries me about giving all this power is that it'll be the runaway train again, where you know, you don't have any choice. You don't have any haggling. They lay down the law. And they're nice, not too bad a sinecures within it. I don't like this idea that race courses, I know my own race course, Jerry Sibby in Kilbeggan, very well run. But I mean, you know, they're running on a very tight ship. And, you know, if HRI, if everything is going to be given to them, and, you know, if you look at under section 10, is it, of the thing, you know, section 10, 1G, and 1M, the negotiation of all income from media rights. So the media rights don't belong to HRI. They belong to the actual race courses. So why should HRI poke their nose at shortly? You know, I mean, where is it going to end? Look, I mean, very often the media rights is the only thing that, like, actually, if there wasn't media rights, there'd be no races. I mean, if the skies and them were putting in a few shillings, you'd have no prize funds, you'd have nothing. You know, very often, and that's that. So I mean, you know, up to now, as I understood it, both HRI and the Association of Racecourses were jointly involved in the negotiation of media rights. But is HRI going to subsume all this function to themselves? And you know, I want to ensure that race courses are out there that have put, you know, I mean, they struggled through the very difficult times and survived and carried out improvements with state investment. I want to acknowledge that as well. I mean, but it's all been for the benefit of ordinary patrons, people who aren't multi-millionaires, but are ordinary people who, very often pensioners, who go in there and then, thankfully, they can avail of their pass and they avail of the reduced rate going in, and that's carried as well, and that's acknowledged. But you know, I know the Association of Racecourses have made the point that they're concerned that obviously, you know, they acknowledge that HRI has a function in negotiating income from media rights belonging to HRI, but that they have legal rights to negotiate income derived from third parties, which is the race courses themselves. And to make the point that if you go back to the 1994 Act, all of that was vested in the actual race courses themselves, under Section 61. So I